The first flower appeared on a Tuesday morning in early April of 1878, and Clara Hastings nearly stepped on it before she even had her eyes fully open. She had stumbled out of her front door the way she always did in those first weeks after arriving in Dusty Creek, Texas, half awake, apron already tied crooked around her waist, her brown hair pinned up in a loose bun that would be fully unraveling before noon. The little homestead she had inherited from her late uncle was still a stranger to her, still smelled like someone else's life. The floorboards creaked in places she had not yet memorized. The wind came through the west window with a whistle she had not yet learned to sleep through. Everything about the town and the land and the dry, sun-baked air felt borrowed, like she was wearing clothes that did not quite fit. But there on the porch step, sitting in a small bunch tied with a strip of plain brown twine, was a cluster of bluebonnets. Clara stopped. She looked up and down the dirt road that ran past her property. There was nothing. No rider disappearing into the distance, no wagon kicking up dust, no figure retreating into the morning haze. Just the wide, open Texas sky turning from purple to orange above the mesquite trees, and the sound of a mockingbird starting its first song of the day. She crouched down and picked up the flowers. They were fresh cut, the stems still damp, and they smelled like the prairie, wild and sweet and honest. She turned them over in her hands, looking for a note, a name, anything. There was nothing. Clara carried them inside and put them in a tin cup of water on the windowsill, and she told herself it was nothing. A neighborly gesture, most likely. People in small towns did things like that when a new person arrived, especially a young woman alone. She was 24 years old, and she had come to Dusty Creek with 2 trunks, a box of kitchen supplies, and the kind of stubborn determination that her mother always said was both her greatest strength and her most exhausting quality. She was not looking for romance. She was looking for a life she could build with her own hands. She put the flowers out of her mind by the time the sun was fully up. The second bunch appeared on the following Tuesday. Same step, same twine, but this time they were Indian paintbrushes, bright orange and red, vivid against the gray wood of the porch. Again, no note. Again, no sign of who had left them. Her neighbor, a stout and good-natured woman named Berta Caldwell, who ran the dry goods store with her husband and seemed to know everything that happened within 20 miles, stopped by that afternoon for a visit. Clara showed her the flowers. "Well, I'll be," Berta said, turning an Indian paintbrush over in her palm. "Someone's sweet on you already." "I've been here 2 weeks," Clara said. "Honey, it doesn't take long, not out here. Single women aren't exactly abundant in Dusty Creek." Berta set the flower down and looked at Clara with the kind of frank, assessing gaze that only older women and doctors ever used. "You haven't seen who it is?" "Not a soul." "Curious." Berta seemed genuinely puzzled, which told Clara that this was not some known town tradition, not some welcoming ritual she had simply not been informed of. "I'll ask around." But Berta came back 3 days later with nothing. Nobody had claimed the flowers. Nobody had seen anyone on Clara's road in the early morning hours. It was as if someone was appearing out of the ground and vanishing back into it. The weeks moved forward the way weeks do in small Texas towns in the spring of 1878, with work and weather and the slow building of routine. Clara threw herself into the homestead with fierce energy. Her uncle had kept cattle, a small herd of 12 that had been taken on by a local rancher named Pemberton, while the property sat empty, and Clara had every intention of building that herd back up. She was not a ranching woman by birth. She had grown up in San Antonio, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a druggist, but she had spent summers here as a child, and something in her had always pulled toward the open land. Her uncle had taught her to ride before she could read a chapter book, and she had not forgotten. She negotiated the return of the cattle with Pemberton, who was a red-faced man with a thick mustache and a habit of looking at her chin when he spoke to her, as though meeting her eyes required more energy than he was willing to spend. He was not rude exactly, but he was dismissive in the particular way that men of that era were often dismissive of women who wanted to do things that men felt were their province. Clara smiled pleasantly and did not back down on a single point of negotiation, and she left his office with a fair deal and the satisfaction of knowing she had irritated him. The flowers continued to appear every Tuesday. Rain or shine, there they were when she opened her door in the morning. Wild bergamot one week, prairie clover the next, then a bunch of yellow Huisache blossoms that smelled so sweetly of vanilla that Clara pressed one between the pages of the journal she kept on her nightstand. She never saw who brought them. She began waking earlier on Tuesday mornings, creeping to the window in the dark pre-dawn hours, but the road was always empty when she checked, and by the time she pulled on her boots and got to the door, the flowers were already there, already waiting, as though they had simply grown up from the porch boards overnight. It was mysterious in a way that was pleasant rather than frightening. There was nothing threatening about it. Whoever this was, they wanted nothing from her. They never knocked, never approached, never left a single word. They only left beauty. They only left something that said without words, "I have noticed you." The town of Dusty Creek had a population of somewhere around 300 souls, which was enough for a main street with a proper saloon, a bank, a church, 2 competing general stores, a livery stable, a blacksmith shop, a small newspaper that came out twice a week, and a doctor's office that doubled as the dentist's. There was a school where Clara eventually volunteered 2 afternoons a week, which she did partly because she liked children and partly because she had spent too many years watching her father love teaching to have no feeling for it herself. She made friends slowly but genuinely. Berta became a real companion, someone Clara could drink coffee with on a Sunday afternoon and talk honestly to, which was rare enough in any era. The young Reverend's wife, a thin, cheerful woman named Mercy Alcott, invited her to the weekly women's sewing circle, which Clara attended not because she was particularly interested in sewing, but because the women of Dusty Creek knew things and she wanted to know them too. It was at the sewing circle in June that someone first mentioned the name Eli Greer. They were talking about the upcoming summer cattle drive, and one of the women, a rancher's wife named Doris Henshaw, mentioned that Jim Harlow over at the Harlow Ranch had finally brought on a new hand who was apparently worth every penny. "Word is he can work a full day that would put 2 men to shame," Doris said, her needle moving steadily through a length of blue calico. "I heard he came up from somewhere around Austin," said another woman, a young widow named Pearl who had taken over her late husband's small apple orchard on the eastern edge of town. "Does anyone actually know him?" Clara asked, more out of conversational instinct than real curiosity. Berta, who was threading a needle and looking pleased with herself for having information, said, "Not well. He keeps to himself something fierce. Doesn't drink, doesn't gamble. Comes into town for supplies once a week, pays his bill and leaves. Jim Harlow says he's the best man he's ever hired and he barely knows his favorite color." "Quiet men make good workers," Doris said. "And poor husbands," Pearl said, and everyone laughed. Clara smiled along with them and thought nothing more of it. The name Eli Greer sat in her memory, the way all new names did, filed away somewhere, attached to nothing yet. July came and the heat was extraordinary, the kind of Texas summer heat that presses down on everything like a physical weight. Clara's cattle were back on her land. She had hired a part-time hand named Tomás, a Mexican man of about 50 who had been working in the area for decades and who knew the land the way Clara knew the insides of her own eyelids. He was reliable and quiet, and he called her Miss Clara in a tone that contained absolutely no condescension, which she appreciated more than she ever said aloud. The flowers kept coming every Tuesday. She had begun to look forward to them with an honesty she tried to keep private. On Monday evenings she would find herself distracted from her book, her mind drifting toward what might be waiting on the step in the morning. There was something deeply romantic about it that she refused to fully admit to herself, because admitting it would mean letting in the vulnerability that came with hoping, and she had not come to Dusty Creek to be vulnerable. She had come to be strong. But the flowers were beautiful, and whoever left them had taste. They always chose something in season, always something native to the land, as if they understood that foreign flowers would be out of place here. There was knowledge in those choices, a knowledge of the land, a sensitivity to it that Clara found herself thinking about more than she thought was wise. She tried again, on a Wednesday morning in late July, to catch the person in the act. She went to bed with her boots by the door and set herself to wake at 4 in the morning, which she managed by sheer will, and she crept to the window and looked out at the dark road for a full 30 minutes. Nothing moved. The night was full of cricket song and the distant low of cattle and a warm, restless wind. At 4:30 she heard the sound of hooves on the road, slow, unhurried, moving away from town, but by the time she got the door open, the road showed her nothing but the last seconds of a shadow dissolving into the dark, and then not even that. She stood on her porch in the warm Texas pre-dawn with her hair down and her boots unlaced, and she felt the flowers beneath her bare feet before she realized she was stepping on them. A fresh bunch of pale pink evening primroses, crushed under her heel. She felt a pang at that, a small and disproportionate grief that surprised her. She gathered them up and went back inside. She mentioned what she had seen, or rather, not quite seen, to Tamaz the next morning while they were walking the fence line. He was quiet for a long moment, the way Tamaz was always quiet before he said something worth saying. "There is a man at the Harlow Ranch," he said at last, "who I have seen riding this road in the early hours. I thought he was checking the eastern pasture boundaries because that land borders yours, but now that you say it I am less certain." "Who?" Clara asked, though something in her already knew. "Eli Greer," Tamaz said. The name landed differently this time. She thought about it all day while she worked. Eli Greer, the quiet man who kept to himself. The one nobody really knew. She turned the pieces over and over like river stones, the timing, the knowledge of native flowers, the fact that the Harlow Ranch's eastern pasture did indeed share a fence line with her property. It was possible. It was more than possible. It began to feel likely, but she still had no face to attach to the name. She went to the summer social at the end of July, a gathering on the church grounds with tables of food and a fiddle player and cold lemonade that had been considered something of a luxury, and she looked for him. She asked Doris Henshaw to point him out, as casually as she could manage, which was not very casually at all, and Doris looked around the gathering and finally said, "He's not here. He never comes to these things." "Never," Clara said. "Not once since he arrived. Jim Harlow tried to get him to come last Christmas, and he apparently looked at Jim like he'd been asked to swim across the Gulf of Mexico." Clara laughed despite herself. The summer tipped into autumn, and the flowers changed with the season. Fall asters in purple and gold appeared, then clusters of late-blooming goldenrod. Once, on a September morning when there had been a rain the night before and everything smelled like wet earth and possibility, she found a single stem of something she didn't recognize, a tall, graceful plant with small white flowers arranged like stars along the stalk. She brought it to Tamaz, who identified it as white mist flower, and said it bloomed along creek beds after the first autumn rain. "It's difficult to find," Tamaz said, studying it. "You have to know where to look." "He knows where to look," Clara said, almost to herself. Tamaz gave her a look that was not quite a smile but was certainly something. She had made up her mind by then. She was going to find out who he was. Not to confront him, not to tell him to stop. She did not want him to stop, and she was honest enough with herself to admit that much now. But she wanted to know. She was a woman who had always believed that knowing was better than not knowing, that clarity was braver than comfortable mystery. She had lived 24 years of her life by that principle, and she was not about to abandon it over a bunch of wildflowers. She went to the Harlow Ranch on a Thursday morning in early October, with the excuse of asking Jim Harlow about whether he knew of any cattle for sale, which was a real enough question and not entirely a pretext. Jim Harlow was a big, loud, good-hearted man in his mid-40s who was genuinely pleased to see her and invited her in for coffee and talked about cattle prices for 20 minutes before she managed to steer things elsewhere. "Your new man, Eli Greer," she said, keeping her voice level. "I've heard good things." "Best hand I've ever had," Harlow said, with the uncomplicated admiration of a man talking about a well-made tool. "Doesn't say much but never misses a thing. Came to me with references from 2 ranches down near Austin. He's got a way with horses that I haven't seen since, well, maybe never." "What sort of man is he?" Clara asked. Harlow thought about it with genuine consideration, as though the question required care. "Decent," he said finally. "That's the word. You can trust him with anything. He's around somewhere. He was working the south pasture this morning." He looked out the window as though Eli Greer might materialize on the other side of the glass on command. "You want me to fetch him?" "No," Clara said, quickly enough that she embarrassed herself. "No, I was just curious. I'd heard the name." She left the Harlow ranch without having seen him. She rode home feeling foolish in a way that was also, underneath it, a little bit wonderful. She had not been giddy about a man since she was 18 years old, and even then it had been brief and painless and had resolved itself sensibly. This was different. This felt like something that was building towards something, though she could not have said what. The first week of November brought a cold front that stripped the last color from the mesquite trees and turned the mornings sharp and silvery. Clara had been in Dusty Creek for 7 months now. The homestead felt like her own at last. She had painted the interior walls of the main room, had gotten the west window to stop whistling, had learned which floorboards to step over and which ones would hold her weight in silence. The cattle were settled. Tamaz had proved himself invaluable. She had a life here that was real and good and entirely her own making. On the first Tuesday in November, she found dried wildflowers on the step, a carefully arranged bunch of seed heads and dried stalks. The colors faded to honey and brown, still beautiful in the way that November was beautiful, honestly and without apology. There was something in that choice that moved her more than the bright summer blooms had. It would have been easy to stop when the wildflowers stopped blooming, to put the practice aside until spring. Instead, whoever this was had found what November had to offer and brought that. That was a kind of devotion. Clara pressed those dried flowers in her journal that night, very carefully, beside the Wisachi blossom from June. In November, too, there was a problem. Berta came to her on a Friday afternoon looking serious in a way that she rarely did, and she brought news that had come in on the mail coach from a town 40 miles east. A man named Vernon Cross was traveling through the region, buying up land through means that were aggressive enough that several families had already been pressured into selling at prices well below fair value. He had already gone through 2 towns east of them, and the feeling was that Dusty Creek was next on his list. "He's got connections," Berta said, her voice low even though they were alone in Clara's kitchen. "Political connections. He gets a judge to put some kind of encumbrance on your deed, and suddenly you've got legal trouble you can't afford to fight." "What kind of encumbrance?" Clara asked. She had grown up listening to her father talk about the law at the dinner table. He had been a great reader of legal papers and newspapers, and she knew more than most women of her time about how such things worked. "Water rights mostly. He disputes the water rights on the property, claims prior claim from some earlier deed, and then you're in court spending money you don't have." "Can he actually make that stick?" "He hasn't lost yet," Berta said, "but most people didn't fight. They just took the money and left." Clara thought about the land outside her window, the dry grass and the mesquite and the cattle grazing in the afternoon light. She had not come all this way to be forced out by a man with a lawyer and a political connection. "I'll talk to Mr. Aldrich," she said. Aldrich was the town's only attorney, a dry and exacting man who had, she suspected, been underestimated all his life and found it useful. "And I'll make sure my deed papers are in order." Berta nodded. "Good girl," she said, and Clara accepted the phrase in the spirit in which it was meant. She spent the following week going through every document her uncle had left, the deed, the water rights certificate, the survey maps, the title history going back to the original land grant from the Republic of Texas. Aldrich reviewed them all with her and confirmed that her claim was solid and clean, that there was nothing Vernon Cross could reasonably attach to. She left his office feeling steadier. She did not stop preparing, though. She had a town meeting to attend in December. She had neighbors to talk to. She had connections to build. If Cross was coming to Dusty Creek, he would find that the people here knew their rights. She made sure of that, calling on the families along her road, sharing what Aldrich had told her about the relevant statutes, making sure people knew to ask questions before they signed anything. It was during one of those visits, on a cold and bright December afternoon, that she finally saw him. She was at the Morrison farm, 3 miles north of her own property, sitting in the Morrison kitchen with the family, a husband and wife and their 3 children, talking about the land grab problem. She had ridden over on her mare, a bay horse she'd named Hazel, and she had tied Hazel to the post outside the front door. She was just standing up to leave, pulling on her coat, when she saw through the kitchen window a man on horseback in the Morrisons' yard, talking with the oldest Morrison boy. She saw him only for a moment, his profile, the set of his shoulders, a dark hat pulled low, and then he turned his horse and rode north and was gone. "Who was that?" she asked. Mrs. Morrison looked out the window. "Oh, that's Eli Greer from the Harlow Ranch. He was helping David fix the north fence last week. Fine man." Clara stood at the window long after he was gone, the cold glass under her fingertips, her coat half-buttoned. His profile had been, she did not know how to describe it in a way that did not sound like she had memorized it, which she had, despite having seen it for only a handful of seconds. Strong jaw, wide shoulders, the posture of a man who was completely at ease in the saddle, who moved with the horse rather than on top of it. That much she had seen before the angle changed, and he was just a silhouette receding into the winter afternoon. She rode home slowly, thinking. Hazel knew the way by now and needed no guidance, which was lucky because Clara's mind was somewhere that was not the road. The flowers had been coming for 8 months. 8 months of beauty and care and patient, wordless attention. And she had just seen the edge of the man who was most likely responsible, and she had felt something that she recognized as significant, a sudden acceleration of her heartbeat, an awareness that ran along her skin like a cold current, a wish that he had turned fully around so she could see his face properly. She admitted to herself on the ride home, more than merely curious about Eli Greer. December deepened. The Christmas season in Dusty Creek was simple and warm in the way that small-town celebrations always are, carols sung at the church, a small gathering at the saloon for the men who didn't care for church, the children performing a nativity play that was endearing in its complete disregard for theatrical quality. Clara helped with the school Christmas program, baking cookies and pinning a paper star to the schoolroom wall, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she felt the full weight of belonging to a place. She brought Tomas and his wife, a gracious woman named Rosa, to the church supper, which earned her some sideways looks from people who had firm feelings about such things. Clara met those looks with the cheerful indifference of a woman who had decided that the opinions of small minds were not worth the energy of confronting and not worth the comfort of avoiding. Rosa sat beside her and they talked about Rosa's garden, and it was a fine evening. Eli Greer did not come to the Christmas celebration. She had not expected him to. But on Christmas morning on her step, there was a small bunch of cedar and dried berries tied with red twine, the only things the winter offered, gathered with obvious care. And Clara sat down on her cold porch step in her nightgown and her coat, and held the cedar against her face and breathed in the sharp, clean scent of it, and she thought, "Whoever you are thinking about me on Christmas morning." That was the moment she decided to stop waiting. She told Berta what she had figured out, or nearly figured out, and Berta, to her credit, did not clap her hands or say anything embarrassing. She listened, and then she said, "So you want to meet him?" "I want to stop being the woman who receives something beautiful every week and doesn't know where it comes from or why," Clara said. "It's been 8 months. That's patient enough." He may stop when he knows you know, Berta said, not unkindly, just honestly. Then I'll know that too, Clara said. She thought about it for 2 more weeks after that conversation, and she came up with a plan that was both simple and completely terrifying. On the Tuesday morning in the second week of January 1879, she got up at 3:30 in the morning and she sat in the chair by her front door in the dark, with a lamp unlit on the table beside her, and she waited. She had not made a fire. It was cold, not dangerously so, but sharply, genuinely cold. She wrapped herself in a blanket and sat in the dark, and she listened to the night sounds, and she waited. She waited a very long time. At 20 minutes past 5 in the morning she heard hooves on the road. Slow, soft-footed, careful hooves, moving at a walk. She held absolutely still. The sound stopped outside her property. There was a long pause. She imagined him listening, the way you do when you are accustomed to early mornings and you trust the signals the silence gives you. Then quiet footsteps on the hard-packed ground. Then the soft scrape of boots on the 2 porch steps. A pause. Then the softer sound of something being set down. Clara stood up. She was shaking, though she did not know if it was the cold or the nerves or both. She put her hand on the door latch. Her heart was enormous in her chest, taking up all the available room. She opened the door. He was still there. He was crouching on the porch step, his back to her, setting down the flowers, and the small sound of the door opening made him go perfectly still for one held breath of a second before he straightened up and turned around. She saw his face in the winter starlight. He was perhaps 27 or 28, dark hair that needed cutting, showing at the collar of a heavy wool coat. Brown eyes that caught the thin light. She could tell even in the dark that they were brown, warm and watchful at once. The jaw she had seen in profile at the Morrisons' farm was every bit as strong head-on, softened by the fullness of his mouth, the slight uncertainty in the line of it now as he looked at her. He was not small, wide shoulders, the kind of hands that came from years of real work, but he held himself carefully, as though he was very aware of taking up space and preferred not to take up more than necessary. They looked at each other. The whole world was quiet around them. "You've been leaving me flowers," Clara said. Her voice came out softer than she intended. He did not deny it. He did not explain himself either, not right away. He looked at her with an expression that was, she could only describe it as open, unguarded, like a man who had been caught at something private and was deciding in real time whether to be ashamed of it. "Yes, ma'am," he said. His voice was low and careful, not unfriendly. "For 8 months, she said. "Since April," he confirmed. "Why didn't you ever knock?" He was quiet for a moment. The horses, his horse, she could now see, a gray gelding tied loosely to the fence post at the road, shifted its weight in the cold. "I didn't think you'd want me to," he said. "Why not?" He took his hat off and held it in front of him with both hands, a gesture of discomfort that was also somehow of respect. "I don't know how to. I'm not good with words. I never have been. I saw you when you first arrived. You were arguing with Pemberton over the cattle and you weren't backing down an inch, and I thought—" He stopped, pressed his lips together, tried again. "I thought you were the most interesting person I had seen in a very long time, but I didn't know what to do about it. I couldn't just walk up to you and say something because I'm not a man who can do that. But there are things I do know. The land, the plants, what grows here and where and when. And I thought," he looked down at the flowers on the step, "I thought it might be a way of saying that I noticed you, without asking anything in return." Clara looked at him standing in the cold winter starlight with his hat in his hands, this man who had spent 8 months speaking in the only language he trusted, and something in her chest shifted open like a door. "What's your name?" she said. He looked up. "Eli Greer." "Clara Hastings," she said, though he clearly already knew. There was a pause, and then she said, "Would you like to come in? I haven't made a fire yet, but the kettle heats fast." His surprise was visible and real. He had not been prepared for this. She could see him recalibrating, adjusting to a reality that had just become very different from any version he'd imagined. "I don't want to impose," he said. "You left flowers on my porch for 8 months, Clara said. "I think we're past imposing." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. It was not quite a smile, but it was the thing that lived next door to one. "All right," he said. She made a fire while he sat at her kitchen table with his hat on his knee, and she made coffee and they talked. Or rather, she talked and he answered, and the answering slowly became real exchange, and the exchange became conversation. She asked him questions, and he answered them with the measured thoughtfulness of a man for whom words were valuable because he had always spent them carefully. He was from Austin originally. His father had been a cattle rancher. His mother had died when he was 12. He had worked ranches across central Texas for the better part of 8 years, drifting between work the way men of his type did, competent and self-contained, and not requiring much beyond useful work and honest pay. He had come to Dusty Creek because a friend of a friend had mentioned Jim Harlow's name, and he'd needed a change of scenery. That was all. He had not planned to stay this long. But then he'd arrived, and there had been this woman arguing with Pemberton about cattle prices, and he had watched her walk away from that meeting with the quiet satisfaction of a person who has won a fair fight, and something in him had simply stopped moving in the direction it had been moving and turned toward her. "You never asked anyone about me," she said. "I asked enough," he admitted. "I knew you were here alone. I knew you were managing the property yourself. I knew you weren't, I mean to say, I heard you weren't." He stopped again, and this time the redness in his ears was visible even in the firelight. "I heard you didn't have a husband or a prospect," he said. "I asked that much," Clara smiled at her coffee cup. "So you knew that much and you still left flowers for 8 months without introducing yourself. I told you, I'm not good with words. But you came every Tuesday, rain or shine. The weather didn't seem like a good enough reason not to." She looked at him across the firelit kitchen table and felt something that was both entirely new and deeply familiar. The sensation of being seen by someone who had been watching carefully, who had paid attention not because they wanted something from you, but because you were worth paying attention to. He left before full sunrise because a ranch hand who disappeared for hours without explanation would be missed. He stood up from the table and thanked her for the coffee with a formality that made her want to laugh, and she walked him to the door. He stepped out onto the porch and then turned back, halfway down the steps. "I don't want to presume," he said. "About what?" Whether you'd want me to," he gestured vaguely, not quite toward the empty space where the flowers had been. "Come back." Clara said. He nodded. "Eli," she said, and his name in her mouth was a new thing for both of them. "You have been thinking about me for 8 months. I have been thinking about you for at least 2. I think you should come back." He put his hat on, that almost smile again. "Sunday," he said. "Sunday," she agreed. He rode off down the road in the blue-gray light of early morning, and Clara stood on her porch watching him go, and she felt the cold on her face and the warmth in her chest and the particular sweetness of a beginning. He came on Sunday. He came in the afternoon, properly this time, in the middle of the day, and she had made a pie from dried apple that she was not entirely confident about, and he ate 2 slices and said it was good, and she did not believe him completely but appreciated the commitment. They walked the fence line of her property in the pale January sunlight, and he showed her places where the fencing was weak and others where the mesquite was encroaching, and he talked about the land with a knowledge and a love for it that she recognized because she felt something similar herself. "Did you grow up around here?" she asked. "No, farther west," he said. "But land is land. You learn to read it." She pointed out the places where she meant to plant in the spring, a kitchen garden along the south wall of the house, and possibly a small peach orchard if she could find good stock. He listened to all of it with the focused attention she was learning was characteristic of him. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer unsolicited opinions. When she finished, he said, "There's a man in Abilene who sells good peach seedlings. I could ask about it." "I'd appreciate that," she said. When he left that evening, he shook her hand, which made her laugh outright, and he looked mortified for a moment before he laughed too, a real laugh, unexpected and full, and it transformed his face entirely. She stored that laugh away in the same place. She stored the dried flowers and the Christmas cedar in the part of herself she was keeping carefully. The next Sunday he came again, and the one after that, and then it was simply a fact of life that Eli Greer came to see Clara Hastings on Sunday afternoons. The town noticed, of course, because in a town of 300 souls, the Sunday movements of any individual are a matter of public record. Berta noticed first, and came to confirm what she already suspected with the directness of a woman who believed in the straightforward approach to information gathering. "Eli Greer is calling on you," Berta said, arriving on a Wednesday with a basket of preserved peaches and an expression of pleased determination. "He visits on Sundays," Clara said. "That's calling on you. We go for walks and talk about land management. That is absolutely calling on you," Berta said firmly. Clara handed her a cup of coffee and said nothing, which Berta correctly interpreted as agreement. The truth was that it was more than Sunday visits by the middle of February. He had begun stopping by on Thursdays on his way to Harlow's South pasture, which did not technically take him past her property, but which could be made to if you went around the long way. He never stayed long on Thursdays, 15 minutes, maybe 20. Long enough for a cup of coffee and a conversation that was always in the middle of something, always picking up where the last one had left off, as if the 4 days between visits were just a pause for breath. He told her, in pieces over several weeks, about his years of drifting, not unhappily, he said, but without direction. He had been good at his work and he'd been paid fairly, and he'd moved on when the season ended, and he had not minded it until he'd started to mind it. There was a loneliness in that life that he had learned to accommodate the way you learn to accommodate a bad knee. You made adjustments, you worked around it, you stopped expecting it to get better. And then he had come to Dusty Creek, and he had seen Clara Hastings refuse to be bullied about cattle prices, and something in him had stopped accommodating. "You watched me argue with Pemberton," Clara said, on a February Sunday when the wind was up and they'd elected to sit inside by the fire instead of walking. "I was in the street when you came out of his office," Eli said. "I'd just come in for supplies. I wasn't trying to watch. I just couldn't look away. And that was enough," she said. "To make you leave flowers every week for 8 months without saying a word." He considered that. "I didn't know if I'd ever say anything. I just knew I wanted to do something." Something that wasn't nothing. Clara was quiet for a moment, watching the fire. Then she said, "The Wisachi blossom from June, I pressed it in my journal." He looked at her. "And the white mist flower from September," she said. "And the Christmas cedar, I kept all of them." He was still looking at her, and the expression on his face was not quite the almost smile. It was something fuller and less guarded and more dangerous. "Clara," he said. "Don't overthink it," she said gently. He reached across the small space between their chairs and took her hand. His hand was large and work-roughened and warm, and he held hers with a carefulness that suggested he was very aware that he was holding something he did not want to damage. She did not pull away. She turned her hand under his and held it back. They sat like that for a long while, watching the fire, not saying anything because nothing needed to be said. February became March, and the weather softened at the edges, and Clara's kitchen garden went in along the south wall, and Eli came most Sundays and most Thursdays, and occasionally on a Tuesday evening when the work at the ranch was done before dark. Tamaz, who noticed everything and commented on very little, had taken to having a convenient task at the far end of the property whenever Eli arrived, which Clara suspected was less coincidence and more courtesy. Vernon Cross arrived in Dusty Creek in the first week of March. He was not what Clara had expected, which was perhaps his most effective quality. She had imagined a blowhard, a man with the obvious markings of greed. What arrived instead was a slim, well-dressed man of about 50, with a courteous manner, and a soft voice and eyes that were pleasant on the surface and entirely flat underneath. He came to her property on a Wednesday morning, arriving politely at a reasonable hour and removing his hat at the door, and he told her he was making inquiries about land in the area. "I'm not selling," Clara said. "I haven't made an offer," Cross said pleasantly. "I know what you're doing," she said. "I know what you've done in Milford and in Crestwood. I've reviewed my deed with Mr. Aldrich and my water rights are clear and documented going back 30 years. I am not a family who can be pressured into selling. I am a woman with a very good lawyer and a great deal of patience for legal proceedings." Cross looked at her for a moment with those flat eyes. Then he smiled. It was a very good smile, technically. "You've done your homework, Miss Hastings." "I have," she agreed. He left without incident, but she did not believe he was done. She had already been working with Aldrich for weeks to make sure her documentation was bulletproof, and she had spoken to every landowner in the surrounding area about theirs. Two families, the Prentices and an older couple named Dahl, had found irregularities in their paperwork that Cross's lawyers might be able to exploit, and Aldrich had been helping them remedy those irregularities before Cross could act on them. She told Eli about the meeting with Cross that Sunday. He listened with the particular stillness that came over him when he was concerned, everything slightly quieter, slightly more focused. "Do you think he'll try something anyway?" he asked. "I think men like that don't give up because you told them to," she said. "I think he'll look for a different angle." "What do you need?" he said. "Not what can I do, not let me handle it. What do you need?" She had noticed that about him, the way he framed things. It was an offering rather than an assumption. "I think the organized opposition from the town is the strongest thing," she said. "If it becomes clear that everyone in Dusty Creek is prepared to contest, legally and collectively, it becomes a much less attractive target. I can talk to some of the men at the ranch," he said. "Harlow's been concerned too. He won't want to see the small landowners pushed out." "That would help," she said. The meeting that came out of those conversations happened on a Friday evening at the church, and nearly 40 people attended. Landowners, merchants, ranchers, even the Reverend, who sat in the front row with the expression of a man who believed that righteousness and property rights were natural allies. Aldrich spoke for 20 minutes about the legal landscape and what tools they had available. Clara spoke after him about the importance of collective response and organized documentation. Eli sat in the back of the room and said nothing, which was, for him, a form of fully present support. Cross made one more attempt, a few weeks later, aimed at the Dahl property, a thin legal claim about a surveying error that Aldrich had already anticipated and preemptively countered. The claim went nowhere. Cross was in town for another week, looking for weakness in the united front and not finding any, and then he moved on to somewhere else, and Dusty Creek exhaled collectively and went back to its normal concerns. Clara felt the release of tension she had been carrying for months, and she felt also the satisfaction of having seen something through. She had protected what was hers and helped protect what belonged to others, and she had done it with knowledge and organization rather than fear. She told Eli the night the news came that Cross had left the county for good. He had stopped by on a Thursday evening and she had been outside when he arrived, standing in the kitchen garden that was just beginning to show green, and she had looked up and said, "He's gone," and Eli had looked at her face and known exactly what she meant and what it meant to her. He got down from his horse. He crossed the distance between them, which was not very far, and he did something he had never done before. He put both arms around her and held her. Clara pressed her face into the shoulder of his coat and felt all the months of careful vigilance finally unwinding. She was not a woman who cried easily, but she felt the back of her throat tighten for a moment before she got it under control. "Good," Eli said quietly into her hair, just that word. She felt it as much as heard it. She pulled back and looked up at him. They were very close. She had been aware of the precise geography of him since January, aware of how he moved and where he stood relative to her and what the shifting of his weight meant, because she had been reading this particular terrain for months. Now they were close enough that she could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, could see the question forming in his face before he had decided whether to ask it. She answered it before he did. She kissed him, and he went entirely still for one startled second, and then he kissed her back with the careful intensity of a man who had been waiting a long time and intended to do this properly. The kitchen garden was behind her, and the late March sky was going pink and gold above the mesquite, and Hazel the bay horse observed the whole thing with the dignified indifference of a well-trained horse, and Clara thought this was the most perfectly located and timed thing that had ever happened to her. Spring came on fast after that, the way Texas spring always does, suddenly, extravagantly, as if the land could not wait any longer. The bluebonnets came up along the roadsides in carpets of deep blue, and Clara thought of the first Tuesday in April almost exactly a year ago, and the little bunch of bluebonnets on her step. On the first Tuesday in April 1879, she was up very early, earlier than necessary, because she had not been able to sleep, because she was 24 years old and in love for the first time in a way that had actual weight and substance to it, and the combination of those facts was not particularly conducive to restful sleep. She was sitting on her porch step in the first pale light when she heard hooves on the road. He stopped at the gate and looked at her sitting there. Then he got down and he came up the path and he was carrying something. It was a bunch of bluebonnets tied with plain brown twine. Clara felt the season come full circle in the most complete way she had ever felt anything, and she stood up and took the flowers from him, and he stood there on her path looking at her the way he always looked at her, carefully, fully, as though she was worth looking at. "It's been a year," he said. "It has," she agreed. "I want to ask you something," he said. He shifted his weight. She could see the effort the words were costing him, the careful internal assembly of the sentence he wanted to say. "I know I don't talk easily. I know that's a real thing about me and it doesn't change. But I want you to know that I think about you every single day, and not just the flowers, the whole of it, who you are and what you've built here and how you think. And I mean to say," he pressed his lips together for 1 second. Then directly, "I'd like to marry you, Clara, if you'd have me." The birds had started. The mockingbird first, then the others, the dawn chorus spreading out across the property in all directions, and the bluebonnets were very blue in her hands, and the man standing on her path was looking at her with the full open expression she had first seen in the winter starlight 7 months ago when she had opened her door and found him there. "Yes," she said, simply and without hesitation. "I'd have you, Eli." He exhaled, a long, slow breath that released something he had been holding, and he smiled. Really smiled this time, the full version, the one she had seen that Sunday in January when he had laughed at his own handshake, and his whole face had opened up. She had never seen anything so beautiful on a man's face. He came up the last 2 steps of the path and took the bluebonnets from her hands and set them on the porch step, and then he took her hands in both of his, and they stood there in the April morning light while the birds sang. "I'll talk to the Reverend," he said. "I'll tell Berta," she said. "God help us," Eli said, with a sincerity that made her laugh. They were married in the 2nd week of May, on a Saturday afternoon when the bluebonnets were still thick along the roadside, and the air smelled of grass and wildflowers, and the bread 3 different women had brought to the church reception. It was not a large wedding. Clara had no family nearby, and her parents had made the trip from San Antonio, her mother crying and her father shaking Eli's hand for a very long time with an expression of assessment that only fathers wore, and then afterward pulling her aside to say, "He's a good man. I can tell, be happy." She intended to. Eli had no family to speak of. His father had died 4 years before, and he had a sister in Houston whom he had written, and she had sent a letter back that was warm and full of questions that made Clara feel welcomed by someone she had never met. He stood at the front of the church in a coat that Berta had insisted on pressing, and he looked at Clara when she walked in on her father's arm with the kind of steadfast attention that made the small church and the rough wooden pews and the slightly off-key piano disappear, and she walked toward him feeling like the only person in a large room. The Reverend read the words, they made their promises, and Eli slid a plain gold ring onto her finger with hands that were perfectly steady, as though this, at least, required no courage at all. They moved into the homestead together, which required some reorganization. Eli had been boarding at the Harlow Ranch, and his possessions were few, but they were real, and they needed places in the house. Clara made room for his books, which turned out to be more numerous than his sparse verbal habits suggested: history and natural science, and two well-worn volumes of poetry that she discovered on the shelf one morning with something like delighted astonishment. "Poetry," she said, holding up one of the volumes. He was pulling on his boots for the day, and he looked up and said, "I told you I was better at reading things than saying them." She sat down on the bed and opened it and read a few lines and looked up at him over the top of the page. "Eli, you have been leaving me flowers and reading poetry, and you told me you weren't good with words." He took the book gently from her hands, leaned down, and kissed her. "I'm better with flowers," he said against her mouth. She laughed into the kiss, and the morning light was coming in through the east window, and it was a perfectly ordinary Wednesday and the most wonderful of her life. He continued to work for Jim Harlow through the spring, but by summer they were talking about expanding the homestead's cattle operation to the point where Clara's land could support him working there full-time. It was not an overnight thing. It required careful planning, additional stock, the negotiation of grazing agreements with the Harlow Ranch so that the land didn't get overgrazed. They worked it out together at the kitchen table in the evenings, Clara with her ledger and Eli with his quiet, accurate sense of what the land could and couldn't do. Tamaz stayed on, which Clara was profoundly grateful for, and he treated Eli with the same respect and straightforward attention he gave everyone, which meant that within a month they had the efficient, low-conversation working relationship of two men who understood each other's competence without needing to say so. In August, Clara discovered she was expecting. She told Eli on a Sunday evening when the sun was going down and they were sitting on the porch, which had become their favorite time of the day, the hour when the heat broke and the sky turned every color it knew. She had been thinking about how to say it for 3 days, not because she was uncertain about his reaction, but because she wanted to say it right, and she finally decided that right meant simply true, and she turned to him and said, "We're going to have a baby." He turned to look at her. She watched the information move through him, the first flash of something she could only call reverence, then the warm certainty of happiness, and then, underneath it all, the particular expression of a man who has spent years moving through the world with only himself to protect and is now rearranging everything to include something much more important. He reached over and took her hand. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Are you all right?" "I'm wonderful," she said. He raised her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, an oddly formal gesture for the man who was sitting in his shirt sleeves on his own front porch, and held them there for a moment. "Good," he said, that word again, the one that in his mouth contained whatever was too large to say more specifically. The pregnancy was generally uncomplicated, which Clara attributed to the clean air and physical work, and possibly to sheer stubbornness. Dr. Maitland, the town doctor, a cautious and competent man who had been practicing in Dusty Creek for 12 years, monitored things at appropriate intervals and told her she was doing well, and she believed him. She continued working through the summer and into the fall, adjusting as necessary, with Eli quietly and consistently ensuring that no task was beyond her capacity before she attempted it, without ever doing the thing that would have been unforgivable, which was making her feel as though she needed managing. Berta threw a party in October in the tradition of the time, a gathering of women who brought useful things for the baby and shared advice, some of it useful and some of it alarming. Rosa came and brought a small blanket she had made, and Clara accepted it with genuine feeling and promised to use it first. Eli spent the late October evenings building a cradle. He did it in the barn, and the sound of the sawing and sanding was a kind of evening music that Clara listened to from the porch with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. He was not a carpenter by training, but he was methodical and patient, the way he was with everything, and what emerged after 2 weeks of evenings was a cradle that was solid and smooth and beautiful in its plainness, without a single unnecessary flourish. He carried it into the house on a Friday night and set it beside the bed, and Clara ran her hand along the polished edge of it and felt something so specific and sweet that it did not have a word. "It's perfect," she said. "It'll hold," he said. Which was, for Eli Greer, saying the same thing. Their son arrived in the second week of March 1880, which meant that the bluebonnets were just beginning along the roadside when he came into the world, yelling with great conviction, at 4 in the morning on a Thursday. Dr. Maitland was calm and capable. Rosa was there. Eli was in the hall outside the door looking like a man who had just faced every fear he'd ever had simultaneously and come out the other side shaken but standing. When Maitland opened the door and told him it was a boy and that Clara was fine, Eli put one hand on the door frame and lowered his head and breathed for a long moment before looking up. Clara was holding the baby when he came in, still in the uncertain way of someone brand new to this particular form of holding. The baby had stopped yelling and was instead making smaller, exploratory sounds, apparently working out the initial terms of his residency. Clara looked up when Eli came in, and the expression on her face was the most important thing he had ever seen. He sat on the edge of the bed, and she laid the baby in his arms, and he held his son the way he had held Clara's hand in January of the year before, with the absolute carefulness of a man cradling something he understood to be irreplaceable. "Hello," Eli said to the baby, very quietly. Just that. Clara rested her head on his shoulder and looked at the three of them reflected in the dark window glass, the small room, the lamplight, the new family inside it, and she felt completely and perfectly located in the world. They named him James Thomas Greer, for her father and for Tamaz, and James Thomas showed his opinion of the name by sleeping through most of the first day with a focus and commitment that Eli recognized as characteristic. Clara pointed this out, and Eli looked at her with an expression that was deeply amused and entirely unable to admit it. The spring that followed James's birth was the finest Clara had experienced in Dusty Creek. The rains came in just right in March and April. The grass came up thick and green. The cattle were healthy and producing well, and Eli had fully transitioned to working the homestead full-time as of February, which meant she saw him all day every day, which turned out to be entirely agreeable rather than claustrophobic, a fact she had not taken entirely for granted. He had a way of working beside her that was collaborative in the most settled sense, not performing helpfulness, not doing things for her because he didn't think she could, but genuinely working with her as a partner, each of them taking on what they were most capable of, adjusting as things changed, talking honestly about what was working and what wasn't. It was a kind of relationship she had hoped for without being entirely sure it existed. The peach seedlings had arrived in March of the previous year from the contact in Abilene that Eli had mentioned, and by this second spring, they were knee-high and showing the determined green of young trees that intended to thrive. Clara tended them with something bordering on devotion, and Eli built a low fence around the orchard to keep the cattle from investigating, and Tamaz pronounced them good stock, with the satisfaction of a man whose professional opinion had been vindicated. Berta and her husband came to supper in April, and there was a meal that Clara had cooked with the confident ease of someone who had been feeding her household competently for 2 years, and the conversation ranged across everything from cattle prices to the new territorial disputes in the northern regions, to a book that Clara and Berta had both been reading. Eli sat at the head of the table and participated in the conversation with the measured, considered frequency that was his nature, and Mr. Caldwell, a broadly good-natured man who had learned over the course of 30 years of marriage to appreciate a well-structured silence, seemed to find him entirely compatible. James sat in the small chair that Eli had built, because of course there had been a small chair, because the cradle had only been the beginning of a quietly productive carpentry sideline that Eli apparently had and had never mentioned, and ate mashed food with the experimental enthusiasm of a person discovering texture for the first time. "He has your eyes," Berta told Clara. "He has Eli's chin," Clara said. "He has opinions about sweet potato," Eli said, which made everyone at the table laugh because James had just expressed a strong one. After the Caldwells left and James was down and the house was quiet, Clara and Eli sat on the porch in the warm April dark, the way they did most evenings, and the stars were enormous overhead the way they always were out here, and the cattle were settled, and somewhere out in the mesquite, the mockingbird was going through its full repertoire with the tireless showmanship that had entertained Clara every spring since her first. "Remember the first flower," she said. Eli had his arm along the back of the porch rail and she was sitting close and she felt more than saw the small smile. "Which one?" "The first one, the bluebonnets, April of '78. "I remember," he said. "I watched you open the door from the road." She looked at him. "You stayed to watch." "I couldn't help it," he said. "I wanted to know if you noticed." "I noticed," she said. "I know." His arm came around her shoulders. "You stepped on the second bunch." "I was trying to catch you," she said. "I heard you get up," he said. "I moved faster." She shook her head. 8 months, she said again, not as a complaint, more as a wonder. "I would have left them for 8 years, he said. "If that's what it took, if you'd never wanted to know." She turned her face up to look at him. In the starlight he was the same man she had seen on the porch step in the dark of January, watching her from behind his own uncertainty, and also entirely different this man she knew now, whose habits and rhythms and thoughts she had learned the way you learned land, gradually and through presence, and who knew hers the same way. "I'm glad I didn't make you wait 8 years, she said. "So am I," he said. He kissed her in the April dark, and the mockingbird kept singing, and the stars were enormous, and their son was sleeping in the cradle Eli had made. In the house Clara had made her own, on the land she had come to from San Antonio with 2 trunks and a box of kitchen supplies and the stubborn determination to build something that was hers. She had built something better. She had built something that was theirs. The years folded forward the way good years do, full and warm and busy, marked by the seasons and the work and the small ceremonies of a life properly lived. The peach orchard grew. By the summer of 1882, it was producing its first real fruit, small and sweet, and so perfect in the way of things that have been tended well that Clara stood among the trees on the first morning of the harvest and felt something that was close to spiritual satisfaction. Eli was beside her, and James, who was 2.5 and intensely interested in everything that grew, reached up and took a low-hanging peach with the proprietary confidence of someone who had been watching this orchard his whole short life. "Careful," Eli said, steadying him. James bit into the peach, and the juice ran down his chin, and he made a sound of pure approval that Clara saved somewhere permanent in her memory. The cattle operation had expanded well. They were running 40 head now, with Tomaz's son having joined him as a second hand the previous year. A young man of 20 named Miguel who had his father's work ethic and his mother's gift for conversation, which balanced Tomaz's quietness perfectly. Eli had proven himself over the years to be exactly the rancher Clara had suspected he could be: methodical, knowledgeable, never panicked by difficulty, always working the problem with patience until it resolved. They had become, without fully intending to, one of the more established homesteads in the region. Not wealthy but stable, not prominent but respected. The kind of people that other people came to when they needed sound judgment and an honest opinion. Pearl came to them the summer of 1882 with a problem. A dispute over the western boundary of the apple orchard with a new neighbor who had bought the adjacent property and seemed to have confused ambition with entitlement. Clara sat with Pearl at the kitchen table, and they went through the survey documents together with the competence of women who had spent considerable time in the previous years understanding property law out of absolute necessity. And by the time they were done, Pearl had everything she needed to take to Aldrich and make her case. Eli brought coffee and then removed himself to the barn, because he had excellent instincts about when to be present and when to be elsewhere, which Clara considered one of his most underrated qualities. James grew. He was the kind of child who was most himself when he was outdoors, always behind Eli or Tomás or Miguel, learning to read the land the way his father read it, asking questions in a steady stream that Eli answered with the same patient care he gave everything. Clara taught him to read from books and to cipher numbers, and his father taught him to track a rabbit and to read a rain cloud and to be honest about what he didn't know yet, and the combination seemed to be producing a person of genuine quality. He was 4 years old when his sister arrived, in October of 1884, and he stood outside the bedroom door for the duration with his hat in his hands in a way that was so exactly like his father that Clara laughed about it for a week afterward, when she had energy to laugh about things again. The girl came quickly and well, a strong, loud arrival on a cold autumn morning, and they named her Rose Marta Greer, Rose for the wild prairie roses that grew along the creek bed, and Marta for Eli's mother, whose name he had spoken quietly to Clara one evening in their second year together, the first time he had spoken of his childhood in detail. Clara had listened to all of it and then taken his hand and said nothing, because she had learned from him that sometimes presence was the most accurate form of speech. Rose was, from the first months, entirely different from her brother. Where James was methodical and observant, Rose was immediate and loud and absolutely certain about everything she wanted, which was, at various stages of her development, her father's attention, the cats that had taken up residence in the barn, and the contents of Clara's button box. Eli handled all three demands with the infinite patience of a man who had once spent 8 months getting up before dawn every Tuesday to leave wildflowers on a porch without knowing if they were ever noticed, and who therefore had an essentially unlimited supply of commitment. Clara watched him with Rose in the evening sometimes, sitting at the kitchen table while she cleared up after supper, James doing his reading at one end of the table and Eli at the other with Rose in his lap, her small hands wrapped around his thumb, his large, work-worn hands holding her with the same absolute carefulness he had shown when James was new. She felt, at those moments, an accumulation of happiness so large and specific that it sometimes made her breath catch. It was Berta who said it plainly, as Berta said most things, at the church fair in the spring of 1885, when she and Clara were sitting in the shade of the cedar elm and watching Eli work one of the competition booths with James beside him, the two of them methodical and focused and entirely unaware of being observed. "You got a good one," Berta said. "I know," Clara said. "He got a good one too," Berta said after a pause. "I want to make sure that's also known." Clara smiled. "He knows." She had made sure of it, in every way she knew, in the care she took with the home they shared, in the honesty she brought to every disagreement they navigated. And there had been disagreements, real ones, because two strong-willed people building a life together in close quarters was not without friction. But they had always gotten back to the same shore, in the thousand small acts of daily love that accumulated over years into something larger and more stable than any single declaration. And in words sometimes. She had always been better at words than he was, and she had used that early on. She had been the one to say things first, to name what was happening between them, to reach across whatever distance his reticence sometimes created. But she had also watched him find his way to his own language over time, not by becoming someone different, but by trusting that the words he did have were enough. She had heard him tell James on a morning when the boy was 5 years old and had skinned his knee and was trying hard not to cry, "It hurts. Let it hurt. Then it stops." And she had thought that was among the most honestly useful pieces of fathering she had ever heard, and that it sounded exactly like the man who had stood on her porch step in January starlight and simply not denied the thing he'd been doing for 8 months. He had said to her on their 4th anniversary, in the way that people in that era marked time, not with restaurants or theater tickets, but with presence and intention. He had come in from the barn at the end of the day, and he had stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "I want you to know that every single one of those Tuesdays was worth it, and every one since." It was the longest romantic statement he had ever made to her, and it had undone her completely, and she had put down the dish she was washing and crossed the kitchen and held on to him for a very long time, and he had held her back with the same steadiness he brought to everything. They were, by the summer of 1885, exactly what Clara had once told herself she had come to Dusty Creek to be: rooted, substantial, real. The homestead had grown into itself, the way land and people grown into each other do when they've been given time and work. The peach orchard was fully mature now and producing abundantly. The cattle herd was healthy and established. The kitchen garden was the finest in the region according to Rosa, whose opinion Clara trusted completely. The house had been added to, a proper second bedroom for James, a porch that had been extended and roofed so it could be used in any weather, a proper washroom that had been considered quite modern for a homestead of its size. Tamaz had retired the previous winter, age catching up with the work, as it eventually does, and he and Rosa had come to supper on his last working day, and it had been one of the best evenings Clara could remember, full of stories and food and a warmth that was entirely familial. Miguel had stayed on as the primary hand, and the young man had grown into exactly the solid, capable person his father had always been, with the additional gift of making everyone around him laugh, which Tamaz had never claimed as a particular strength. On the last evening of August 1885, when the summer heat was just beginning to lose its full ferocity, and the prairie evenings were starting to carry that first hint of the coming autumn coolness, Clara and Eli sat on the porch after the children were asleep, the way they still did most evenings, with the stars enormous overhead and the mockingbird going through its repertoire somewhere out in the dark mesquite. James was 5. Rose was not quite a year old yet and had been, in the manner of young children who are very certain about their opinions, recently discovered to have an intense feeling about the sound of the mockingbird, which was that it was personally directed at her and should be acknowledged. She had, in fact, attempted to respond to it earlier in the evening from the kitchen window, which Eli had received with an expression of perfectly straight-faced wonder. "She's going to be something," Clara said now. "She already is something," Eli said. "Something specific," Clara said. "I'm not sure yet what." "Loud," Eli offered. "That's specific," Clara laughed. The porch boards were familiar under her feet. The stars were where they always were. The land stretched out in the darkness beyond the fence, their land, the land she had come to with everything she owned in 2 trunks and had made into this. She thought of the bluebonnets, the first ones, and then all the ones after. The Indian paintbrush and the prairie clover and the huisache and the white mist flower that had required knowing where to look along the creek bed. The dried November seed heads that had said, without words, "I will find what is beautiful in whatever season this is." The Christmas cedar. The circle of it, a year of flowers, and then a knock on the door that was not a knock but an open door standing in the cold dark on a January morning. She looked at Eli sitting beside her in the porch chair, his long legs stretched out, his hat on the rail, the lines at the corners of his eyes that had deepened over 7 years of sun and weather and laughter, more of the laughter than either of them would have predicted at the beginning. He was looking out at the dark in the comfortable way of a man who was entirely at peace with where he was. "Eli," she said. He looked over. "Thank you for the bluebonnets," she said. He understood immediately that she meant the first ones. The April morning 7 years ago. He studied her face for a moment in the way he always did, that full, careful attention that had never diminished, that she had never once taken for granted. "Thank you for opening the door," he said. She reached over and took his hand in the dark, and he held it with the same firm gentleness as always, and the mockingbird sang, and the stars burned steady overhead, and somewhere inside the house, their children slept, and the land lay quiet and whole around everything they had made. She had come to Dusty Creek with 2 trunks and a stubbornness she had not known what to do with yet. She had found something she had not known she was looking for. She had built a life that was real in every possible direction, the kind of life that held its shape in all weather, that had roots deep enough to outlast any season. And it had all begun on a Tuesday morning in early April, when she had nearly stepped on a small bunch of bluebonnets on a porch step and looked up at an empty road and wondered. She tightened her hand around his, and the night settled warm and whole around them both. The mockingbird sang on,